Okay, go ahead.
Knoxville had been growing really since 1870. After the Civil War, freed slaves had come in from the countryside looking for a new life. So had rural whites. There's a post-war population explosion. And Knoxville takes off briefly as a poster child for the New South. For some of these whites coming in, it's the first time they've ever worked beside a black person. They're living, some of them almost side by side. And there's a lot of conflict going on. Even though the city leadership tries to turn a blind eye to it, it's there. And as a matter of fact, there had been a study done by a University of Tennessee graduate student in 1919 in which she predicted these conditions will lead to some sort of racial violence. If something isn't
It's
done.
like a statue.
Knoxville was a stage city where race relations were pretty good. Black people knew their place and stayed in it.
Looks like a hat.
And I think we had a white paternalistic society that left black people to their own devices as long as they didn't create a lot of trouble. To me, it was interesting how the local newspapers described the black community. For example, the corner of Vine and Central was a place where there were a number of black establishments, where there were grocery stores,
What happened?
taxi cab companies, or shoe shine parlors. That area was described as Little Harlem. And of course, that's kind of a compliment because Harlem was a very thriving place in New York City, and to be compared to that, I think had to be received as a compliment. 1919 was a very volatile year all across the country. It was certainly just after the end of World War I, and there were a number of black men coming back to this country, having fought overseas, and they were coming back into a racial situation that they just couldn't appreciate because they had some measure of freedom and dignity overseas, but had to come back to this country and suffer from racial indignities. And consequently, there were a number of race riots throughout the country. My memory tells me that there were at least 25 of them across the United States. And James Weldon Johnson, who was head of the NAACP, termed it the Red Summer, because in many cases some of the streets literally ran red with blood.
In addition to the racial and labor tensions that are going on nationwide, there was a great deal of political tension. The mayor, John E. McMillan, was up for re-election. One of the reasons that the mayor was controversial at that time was his progressive attitude towards race relations. He had been elected largely with black votes. He had made an address to the black business leaders denouncing the riots elsewhere, he had denounced lynching, and had said that he personally intended to make sure that nothing like that could ever happen in Knoxville. There had been threats against black voters, warnings that black voters should stay home on election day. Threatening posters had been posted around town. The mayor had a lot of black campaign workers, one of them being Maurice Mays. Maurice Mays had spent that entire day campaigning for the mayor, handing out campaign flyers and poll tax receipts. In those days, Tennessee has a poll tax. You have to pay the poll tax in order to vote. But if someone pays the poll tax for you and you have a receipt, that's perfectly fine. And he had been handing out poll tax receipts all day to black voters with the understanding that they would vote for John E. McMillan. Maurice Mays was rumored to be the illegitimate son of the mayor, John E. McMillan. And according to members of McMillan's family, it was acknowledged as true. His mother had been a young maid who left Knoxville shortly after his birth. He was about 6 months old when he was adopted by William and Frances Mays.
Maurice Mays was a black fellow who was very handsome, who liked white women, and white women liked him, and certainly 1919 was not the year to have these kinds of relationships. So there was a police officer in Knoxville who knew about Mays's activities and had warned him about dating white women, and threatened to put him in the penitentiary if he were ever to catch him, and to do other terrible things to him if he caught him. A white woman by the name of Bertie Lindsay wound up murdered.
The 27-year-old Bertie Lindsay was born Bertie Smith in Lee County, Virginia. In 1916, she married Daniel P. Lindsay, a carpenter from Dandridge, Tennessee, and worked at the Standard Knitting Mill. Her bedroom assault and murder at 1612 8th Avenue in North Knoxville was witnessed by her younger cousin, Ora Smith.
Well, the policeman who hated Mays was investigating the case, and he said, I know exactly who that murderer was. So they went to Mays's house and rousted him out of bed and took him to the scene of the crime, put him under a dimly lit street lamp, and the woman identified him as the murderer. This woman had been sleeping in the bed with her cousin who was murdered, who said that it was a black man who committed the crime, and identified Mays as the murderer. And he said, that couldn't be. I've never been in this neighborhood before. I don't know anybody here. Mays was taken to the Knox County Jail. And Mayor McMillan had gotten him out of trouble early on when he was about 17 years old. So people thought that McMillan would get him out of this.
He's already expressing fears to the sheriff. It's not safe. They're going to try to lynch him. There was apparently a brief mention in the morning paper, the Knoxville Journal and Tribune, to the effect that a white woman had been killed and a black man arrested. It's not entirely clear what it was. It was apparently probably a one-page extra. That has not survived. Word gets around very quickly. Bertie Lindsay's body is being prepared at Robert's Funeral Home, which is near Market Square. Market Square is the traditional gathering place. There are restaurants, the old market house, saloons. By mid-morning, people are already beginning to come to the funeral home, passing through and staying at Market Square to congregate. It's Saturday. Now, in those days, typically businesses worked half day on Saturday. So around noon, everybody starts to get off work. It's Labor Day weekend. Some people immediately start getting watered down for the weekend. Around the same time, the afternoon paper, the Knoxville Sentinel, hits the street. Now, we don't know exactly what that day's edition said because, again, no copies of that have survived. And apparently there were some inflammatory statements in the articles that there was at least a picture of Bertie Lindsay and apparently some sort of a headline that was sensational. Again, we don't know exactly what that was. Not too long after the paper hits the street, the sheriff begins noticing that things are definitely starting to turn ugly and it's time to do something.
And word got out that he was the murderer of a white woman, a mob formed. Now this was very unusual for Knoxville. I mean, mobs just didn't form in Knoxville to string anybody up. In fact, in all of my reading, I have yet to find where somebody has been lynched in Knox County. I mean, the sheriff did a lot of legal lynchings, but this never happened. The sheriff knew the mob was coming and devised a plan to take Mays to safety.
He borrows one of his wife's dresses. They dress Maurice Mays up, sneak him out, take him by car down to Concord, slip him aboard the train there, and out of town. Now, meanwhile, back at the jail, the crowd keeps forming. In an effort to get the crowd to disperse, the chief deputy, Carol Cate, agrees to let a committee of men come through and inspect the jail. We'll show you who's not here. So they take them through, take them all around. They come out and say, well, we can't find him. The crowd's not satisfied. So they put together another committee, bring them through. And then a third, and then a fourth. At which point, some people in the crowd start shouting, we're just going to follow them in and see for ourselves. And then they slam the doors. In between the searches, Jeff Claver, one of the ringleaders, has made his way up to Market Square. There's a bigger crowd forming up there. Some of these are people who've been to funeral homes, some of them are people just drinking, getting ready for the weekend. He starts addressing the crowd. Carol Cate, the chief deputy, later estimated there's going to be 4,000 or 5,000 people. Someone gives the command, march, boys. A lot of these guys are World War I veterans, some are Spanish-American veterans. There are even accounts of some of the riders arrested were as old as in their 70s. Some of them were Civil War veterans. They march down Market Street, counting off military style until they just basically surround the jail. They refuse the final offer to search, and at that point, they tear down a telephone pole, start using that as a battering ram. The main doors hold, but there's a side door, and it proves to be a little bit weaker. And finally use dynamite to blast their way in. Once they're inside, it's a free-for-all. Most of the deputies basically give up, stand back. They know they're outnumbered. They turn all the prisoners loose. Interestingly, they leave the black prisoners untouched.
They tore up the jail to the tune of $50,000. And that was a lot of money in 1919 after suffer that kind of damage. They drank up all the confiscated moonshine whiskey and other whiskeys that were there and got drunk and left the jail vowing to kill every black person they saw in revenge.
The National Guard was summoned. By the time the soldiers do arrive, they're still outnumbered by the crowd. The adjutant general addresses the crowd, tries to reassure them that justice is going to be done. You might as well go home. That doesn't work. There's an expectation in the black community that this is going to be taken out on us. They've found Maurice Mays to blame, but they're going to blame all of us.
But the black community was aware of this, and men who were in gun clubs and who were hunters decided to meet the mob head on. So there were a number of men returning from World War I, and they just said, we're not going to take this anymore. They perhaps, before that time, bit their tongues and put up with it, swallowed deeply and put up with it, counted to 10 and put up with it. But having fought in that war, they decided, we're just tired of this stuff and we're just not going to take it anymore. And I think that was the difference.
When the rumor reaches the mob that black men are holding up white people at Vine Central, which was not true, there's no evidence that was happening, the mob surges up Gay Street towards Vine. And the guard joins them. They later said they were restoring order. Basically, they were just siding with the whites. The mob starts breaking into stores all along Gay Street and the surrounding streets, stealing guns, knives, baseball bats, and any type of weapon they can get their hands on. They surge out toward Vine Street. The whites are basically amassed up here at Vine and Gay. Down at Vine and Central, in the black community, they have made siege preparations. They've shot out the street lights. There are reports that there was furniture, box crates, that sort of thing, stacked in the streets to create barricades. And it becomes a standoff at that point. National Guard has their machine guns. They bring them in on the back of a truck. And they set one up near Vine and Gay. They set them up on each side of the street, and they crossfire. The guys manning them are not experienced machine gunners. A lot of most of the kids, some of them are as young as 15, 16 years old. Most of them have not been in battle. There was one lieutenant who tried to make his way down to the corner of Vine and Central to scout out what was going on. He gets wounded by fire from the black side, staggers out into the street. Someone in the mob screams, "Let him have it." And at that point, one of the machine gunners panics and basically just starts spraying the street with bullets. He's caught in the crossfire and almost literally sawn in half. And it takes several minutes for the officers to get the machine gun crew back under control. The main fighting near Vine and Central lasts for several hours, at least up into the morning of the following day. There was fighting all along Central Avenue, which was essentially the border of the black community. People were fighting on the bridges. There are accounts of the black men trying to literally charge the machine gun nests, World War I over-the-top style, and being mown down. At some point during the battle, it starts to rain. The general description from both sides was that Vine Avenue was a river of blood. The real toll was probably never going to be known. The official count was first 5, then 2. One casualty being Lieutenant Payne, the other being Joe Henner, a black Spanish-American veteran storekeeper who was acknowledged as one of the leaders on the black side. How many more? There are all kinds of accounts.
Every time I hear the story, somebody has added something to it. and it gets so ridiculous. For example, I heard from somebody else that when they were building the city-county building, that they unearthed this mass grave, and somebody said it was from bodies from the race riot of 1919. I've heard that. And I've heard so many stories about it that really just don't add up. And so the more people hear about it 20th hand, the more the story is embellished.
Knoxville is under basically martial law for the next few days, pretty much through the Labor Day weekend. Mayor authorizes special deputies, dozens of people deputized, issued guns, and asked to basically patrol their communities. There's some question as to how much order the special deputies actually kept and how much disorder they actually started. There were rumors in white communities of invasions by roaming bands of armed black men. Same thing happened in the black community, accounts of roving bands of white men running around. The phone rang off the hook at the police department for the next few days with reports of all these things, and the majority of it was not true. Most of the guns taken during the break-ins on Gay Street never came back. The owners went so far as to run huge ads in the newspaper saying, "Please return our guns and you won't be prosecuted, no questions asked." But they never got it back. There was a trial. There was actually more than one trial. There was a mass indictment. There were 55 men and women, all of them white, ultimately arrested and charged with some role in the riot. All but 5 were acquitted. Charges against 3 were dropped before they got to the jury. The jury deadlocked on 2 men. Neither served more than a year's jail time. Maurice Mays is brought back to Knoxville. He was given a fairly sizable defense team of court-appointed lawyers. Chief counsel was Reuben Cates. There was William Yardley assisting. He also had 2 other lawyers, but Cates was the chief counsel. Prosecution was handled by the local district attorney, Rufus Minot. Within about a month or so of the riot, the jury deliberated about 18 minutes before finding him guilty of murder. The defense at the first trial made the effort to introduce testimony from some white women who were willing to testify that they had been assaulted in the same fashion as Bertie Lindsay and Laura Smith after Maurice Mays' arrest. The judge refused to allow that. That number would increase in later years. The attacks on women continued long after his arrest.
Maurice Mays could handle the English language very well. And in fact, when he was in prison, he wrote a number of letters to people across the country asking for support. He wrote poetry. There were people like James G. Beck in Knoxville, a prominent black person, who asked for help from the National NAACP to help them raise funds to help Mays with his defense. The NAACP had problems all across the country because there were at least 25 cities in turmoil with these race riots. And of course, there were other problems that the NAACP was concerned with. There were many, many lynchings in the United States that they were concerned with. So they just didn't have the money to share, even though there were a number of appeals from Knoxville to help the situation. But what intrigued me more than that is that there were prominent black men in Knoxville who had money, who could have contributed to the cause, but they did not. And I don't know whether they were intimidated, whether they thought there would be repercussions if they contributed to the cause. And the pastor at Mount Zion Baptist Church, who was heading up the fundraiser, said he didn't understand it either. He said there are these people of means, but they are as silent as clams.
He's tried once, he's convicted. The judge gives the verdict his hearty approval and sentences Maurice Mays to death. By the second trial in 1921, the number of women who are willing to testify that they've been attacked in the same manner after Mays' arrest has increased to 15. And witnesses. That includes one woman who says that the man stuck a gun in her face and said, "Lay still or I'll kill you like I did that Lindsay woman." Again, the judge refuses to allow that testimony. Again, he's convicted. Again, the defense appeals. This time they're turned down. The case goes before the governor now.
Governor Taylor, won't you please come out to the prison to see me? I am eager and very anxious to explain to you personally some valuable information that you should certainly know. Please, allow me to urgently beg for your presence. Humbly yours, Maurice Mays, Death Chamber.
He appealed to the governor and everybody else. The newly formed Knoxville NAACP got involved in the case, and they attempted to raise money for his defense. But none of that did any good. So Mays was eventually sent to the electric chair in March of 1922. And I always say that he really wasn't electrocuted for murdering the white woman, because I never saw any evidence of that in any of the court transcripts that I read. But he went to the electric chair for dealing with white women, which was a real taboo in 1919. So he paid with his life for that indiscretion rather than being convicted of the murder for which he was accused. There was a funeral in Knoxville, but there were people in Knoxville who didn't want the funeral here because they didn't want to stir up trouble. Finally, the pastor at Logan Temple, AME Zion, where his parents were members, agreed to conduct the funeral. When he got up to do the eulogy, he said, "You've all read the obituary, you know the story of the decedent. Undertaker, take charge." And that was basically the sermon at the funeral. Now, thousands of people attended. They walked past the casket, both blacks and whites.
What's happening in the first 2 decades of the 20th century to make it such a fertile moment for racial violence, mob violence of all kinds? The violence of the early 20th century seems to become almost predictable. And I think part of that is the way in which the justification for lynching becomes elevated to the point where it's incorporated into American popular music, into American popular film, like Birth of a Nation, D.W. Griffith's epic movie, which is really a call for white supremacy. What was being elevated was the idea that African American men were primitive, brutal, violent, and prone to transgress against whites, but especially white women. So that notion of the black rapist got elevated in the early 20th century. And we can only imagine the effect of incorporating that image into a movie that was so unprecedented in its cultural impact. There's no way we can come up with a contemporary analogy. Birth of a Nation provided an incredibly visceral film rendition of the black threat. And that's 4 years before Knoxville, 4 years before the Red Summer.
In From Race Riot to Sit-In, Arthur I. Waskow categorized Knoxville's Red Summer with Omaha, Nebraska's unrest as a particular form of violence. The Jailhouse Riot. The two jailhouse riots of 1919 had a number of peculiar features. Both were connected with local political rivalries and the control of underworld activities. Both originated in anger at a black man accused of rape. Both were stopped before the initial incident could turn into a full-scale riot between the races. And both events were a combination of an insurrection against state authority and a pogrom against the black community. In Omaha, Nebraska, the accused William Brown was successfully kidnapped by the mob, shot, lynched, burned, and left on display at a major intersection. Certainly, and without any uniqueness, Knoxville, Tennessee was well on its way to a similarly shameful exhibition if events were left to run its intended course.
I don't think here in Knoxville it really rose to a race riot as it did in some other cities, but there certainly were clashes in this city that would lead one to think that Knoxville had a race riot. It shattered the belief and feeling that Knoxville had great race relations and things like that that happen elsewhere couldn't happen here. We've never had a lynching in Knox County. We just didn't have those atrocities that happen in other places. What I think and what we've been trying to do for a number of years is to have the governor of Tennessee to clear Mays' name, because it's obvious to all who read the case and who understand it know that the man was not guilty of that crime. And we've worked with, I think, 3 governors now attempting to get that done, but we've been very unsuccessful.
Knoxville's Red Summer was made possible by support from the Open Society Foundation and from viewers like you. Thank you.
The Knoxville